So I was really excited when I finally got my hands on a PS5 last year. I've had some great next generation experiences with Astro's Playroom, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and more. These games really demonstrate the power of the PS5 nicely. However, as the console generation goes on, it's become clear to me that Sony's direction for PlayStation going forward is just something that I'm not really a fan of. There are plenty of reasons that I feel this way, and a lot of it is related to Sony's first-party game development. If you take a look at PlayStation now versus PlayStation in the 90s and early 2000s, you'll see that there has been a massive shift in the types of games they make. Back during the PS1 and PS2 days, there was so much more variety. Sony made platformers, stealth games, and even JRPGs. Some of my favorite games in PlayStation's entire history are those classic titles like the Ape Escape series, which I've talked about to death on this channel, and even more recently the Gravity Rush games. But sadly, it seems like Sony just isn't interested in making those kinds of games anymore. This fact was solidified by the announcement of Japan Studios' closure. If there was anything that made me really dislike modern PlayStation, this was it. Closing down that studio, which was their oldest by the way, communicated more than anything that this is no longer the Sony I grew up with. Under Jim Ryan's leadership, PlayStation only cares about AAA blockbuster titles, and anything that isn't a multi-million seller is a waste of time. Say what you want about how Sony's newer games sell way more than their older games, but even Sean Layden, the previous head of PlayStation, believed that the smaller titles were important to have around. I personally think that Japan Studios games were important because they added much needed variety to PlayStation's first party lineup, and they also had a dedicated fanbase who likely would have gone out and bought a PS5 for a new entry in these games, and naturally that would lead them to purchase some of Sony's other games since they've already invested in the system. I'd like to use Nintendo as an example. I promise I'm not a fanboy with these comparisons, but look at games like Xenoblade or Astro. They're not massive games in terms of sellers, like they don't have the same amount of success as games like Zelda, Mario, or Smash, but they're great to have as they help to fill out the year when the bigger releases aren't quite ready. And that's what's missing from Sony's first party lineup, and because of that, I haven't bought many games from Sony this year, if at all. There are games like Kena Bridge of Spirits, among other indies and Japanese games funded by Sony, but those aren't really first party. All that really came out from Sony this year was Gran Turismo 7 and Horizon Forbidden West, and I'm not really interested in those games. And it just feels like Sony's first party output this year has been pretty lame. If you aren't into every game Sony makes, you're pretty much just waiting for the next big game, which is the case for me. I'm not buying God of War Ragnarok, at least not until I finish the original, and that's probably going to be a while. That's not to say that their current games are bad or anything. I mean, Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and Ratchet and Clank are some of Sony's best games right now, and I'm impatiently waiting for Spider-Man 2 next year, but compared to what they've done in the past, there's not enough variety. A lot of their games can be boiled down to being narrative-driven single-player experiences, and while that formula is awesome, I find myself missing their classic games more and more as the years go on. Another issue that became even more apparent recently is Sony's insistence on remastering games that run just fine on current hardware. The first example is The Last of Us, which was a PS3 game that was remastered for PS4, therefore it could run on PS5 through backwards compatibility. I can understand the thought process behind it as Sony's working with HBO to make a Last of Us series, and they want a new game out there to have that cross promotion, but to me it still felt like it was a little unnecessary. They also remastered the original Spider-Man PS4 game, but that was sold for $20 if you already bought Miles Morales, so that wasn't that bad. I thought that would be it in terms of pointless remasters, but now we're hearing rumblings of Sony working on a remaster of Horizon Zero Dawn, a PS4 game that came out 5 years ago. This is even more ridiculous considering that the game was just patched this year to run at 60 FPS on PS5, so what is the point of this? You're telling me that we can't get any new entries in their classic games, but they can just remake the same games over and over? And you know that this is going to be a full price game too. And this kind of opens up the possibility of even more PS4 remasters for PS5, and at this rate I wouldn't be surprised to see God of War come back for the PS5 at some point. I'm not outright saying that they're creatively bankrupt because we are getting some new games, but this is something that actually frustrated me as someone who invested $500 for their new console. I mean, where's the incentive to own this thing? Right now I only have 2 games that are truly exclusive to PS5, those being Ratchet and Astro, and with how fast Sony is porting their catalog to PC, that number is probably going to drop to 0. Add the fact that they're still saying that future titles might come to PS4, and I have to wonder why these consoles came out so early when they're clearly not ready to move on. For a console that's almost 2 years old, there's a pathetic amount of true current gen only games, which blows my mind considering how much they're charging for these games. In some cases, the PS5 version of a game that has the exact same content as the PS4 version costs $10 more. If it weren't for the fact that there's always some time before their games come to PC, I'd regret owning a PS5, and even then, the fact that we just know that eventually they'll release games day and date just has me wondering when that day will come. I'm gonna keep it real, I didn't like it when Xbox did it, and I don't like the idea of Sony doing it either. More people playing games and having access to them, that's all well and good, but from a personal perspective, I feel that exclusives are the reasons to buy consoles, and in an admittedly selfish way, it validates my purchase. But I also understand that this push for PC means that people don't have to go out and buy a console for a game or two, so it makes sense why the industry is headed the way it's headed. But at the same time, I guess old-fashioned Nintendo will continue to play to their strengths and be the only company actually making exclusives for their consoles going forward, which is really weird that we've gotten to this point. But back to the main topic at hand, between the closure of Japan's studio, the unnecessary remasters and remakes, the raising the price of the PS5 in multiple different regions, and them consistently lying to their customers, Sony has quickly reminded me why I'm glad there's competition in the gaming space with Xbox and Nintendo. Recent events have highlighted how hypocritical Sony can be. Currently, they're not happy with Microsoft's purchase of Activision because it could possibly spell the end of Sony getting Call of Duty games in the future, which is hilarious coming from the company that pays a ton of money to keep games from coming to Xbox. The most popular example being the Final Fantasy games. You can't make all of these shady deals behind the scenes to bolster your exclusive lineup that isn't even first party, and then cry when Microsoft does something about it. And from a business standpoint, I know why they're not okay with this deal going through, but they need to figure out something because all signs point to this deal going through, and with Microsoft spending almost $70 billion for this acquisition, they're not going to keep those titles multi-platform. While I'm not really a fan of seeing publishers get bought up in a sort of arms race between Microsoft and Sony, if this means Sony will have a lot more pressure on them, then I'm kind of for it because that's when we as consumers get the best products. I don't care about these massive corporations. All I ask is that the big three stick around. I've bought consoles from all of them, but Sony just needs to have a bit of pressure applied to them because they've gotten way too complacent recently, and their focus on maximizing profit with little effort, among other things, isn't really benefiting consumers in any way. Anyway, to end this video, the PlayStation brand has become a disappointment, and I don't like the direction they're headed, but that's pretty much all I have to say. I know it's a bit of a negative video, which I don't really do all that much on the channel, but this is something that I felt like making in light of all of the bad press Sony has been getting. Anyway, if you like this video, leave a like, if not, leave a dislike, and if you want to see more videos from my channel talking about a plethora of games from both PlayStation and Nintendo consoles, hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, guys. See you in the next video.